Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored and grateful for the opportunity to speak here at this prestigious session of the European Society of Cardiology and the Israel Heart Society. During the next 20 minutes, I would like to share with you some of my thoughts on problems that we have with ICD management, and I will use some of the results of the recently established National ICD Registry to support and to illustrate some of these problems. Let me just tell you a few words about the Israeli ICD Registry. It was started in July 2010 by the Israeli Working Group on Pacing and Electrophysiology, which is part of the Israeli Heart Society. It's a voluntary registry that includes all the implanting centers. All the high-power devices, ICD and CRT-D, are being either implantations or replacements are being reported online at the end of the procedure. We have nearly 100% compliance, more than 95% compliance. Since the beginning of the registry, we have about 2,400 new implants registered, 70% of which are primary prevention, and we have 931 replacements. We recently started a follow-up phase that already has 640 patients with an average follow-up of nearly a year after implantation. We do have to treat this data as preliminary data only. The good thing about ICD, it's needless to say here, ICD save life. There is a whole list of trials that prove the efficacy of ICD in saving lives, both in primary prevention and secondary prevention. And I'm not going to list all these data. As a result of all these studies, guidelines were put together that influenced the rate of ICD implantations. And these are the graphs of the rate of implantation in Europe, in red, and the United States over the years. And if you look at the previous decade, starting in the year 2000 and ending at the year almost now, the numbers in the United States increased fourfold, and they are now standing on a huge number of 650 ICDs per million per year. And the numbers in Europe actually increased eightfold. So there's a huge increase in ICD implantations, which follows the landmark studies over the years. We are standing somewhere in the middle of Western European countries. We are at, we can see it on the results of the registry. We are at about 210 implants per year, which is somewhere in the middle of the Western European countries. Of course, we are much, much behind the huge rates of United States, and Italy, by the way, is the most active European country. Used to be Germany. However, all this wealth of ICD implantation brings with it several problems, and there are many, but I'm going to highlight some of them. The first is that real-life benefit may be smaller than what we see in randomized controlled trials. Second is that most primary prevention ICDs never deliver therapy. So there's the cost effectiveness is not so favorable, and we probably need better selection criteria for ICD implantation beyond the ejection fraction. There are inappropriate shocks that are very severe problem to the patients. There are system malfunctions, recalls, and also infections. And there is an issue of the possibility that shocks actually deteriorate the CHF status as well as affect the survival of patients with ICDs. So let me review these with you and use some of our data to try to have a better look at them. So the first issue is whether real-life benefit may be smaller than randomized controlled trials. And there are several reasons for this. First of all, the guidelines and the practice that follow the guidelines are based on the study inclusion criteria, whereas in the studies there was an actual enrolled population that is little different from the criteria. For example, the guidelines recommend implantation of ICDs in patients with ejection fraction below 35%, based on the SCAD-HEFT results. But there were very, very few patients with ejection fractions close to 35 that were actually included in the studies. The average ejection fraction in the studies was somewhere in the mid-20s. So there is very little evidence to support the use in patients with relatively high ejection fraction, and the benefit there is probably somewhat lower. The studies did not exclude elderly patients, but there were very few patients above the age of 80 that were included in the actual studies. The practice does include elderly patients. And there were very few patients with severe chronic renal failure that were included in the studies. However, we used ICDs in these patients. Moreover, beyond the fact that the actual enrollment is different from the inclusion criteria, the practice is even more different. I put together here the average number of the MEDIT-2 population on the right-hand column compared to our population of the registry in primary prevention cases. And as you can see, there are several differences. Some of them may act in favor and some of them may act against the effect of ICDs. But there is difference. There's difference in the gender distribution. Our population include more than 50% CRTD, whereas the original MEDIT-2 preceded the period of the CRTD. The rate of diabetes is different. We have more patients with advanced heart failure, whereas the MEDIT-2 had less patients with advanced heart failure. Overall, you can see that there is a difference between the practice and the studies. The second issue is that most of the ICDs never deliver therapy. If you look at an average lifetime of a device of about 5 years, the majority of the ICDs implanted, at least for primary prevention, which is currently the main indication, the majority of the ICDs will be replaced without having delivered any therapy. So we need to have better selection criteria if we don't want to waste money and we don't want to implant excessive ICDs. If we look at our data taken from the follow-up phase of the ICD registry, as I mentioned before, it's about 650 patients. Looking at the ICD treatments over time, this line describes the primary prevention group, and this is the secondary prevention group. And if we concentrate on the primary prevention group, which is the majority, we can see that over 1 year, there is less than 5% appropriate therapy given by the ICDs. And needless to mention that appropriate ICD therapy doesn't necessarily mean life-saving therapy. Many of them are given for some arrhythmia that would have terminated anyway. But we have less than 5% activity. And if we extrapolate it to the lifetime of a device, average 5 years, about 1/4 of these devices, maximal, will operate. By the way, if we look at the MEDIT-2 results, the amount of therapies was higher. This is the probability of appropriate ICD therapy. If you take 1 year, they had about 12 or 13%. So our results or our practice implant ICDs on patients who are even much lower risk than the MEDIT-2 patients for any arrhythmia. And this is concerning because we are wasting money and we're implanting excessive ICDs. So there is a need for better selection criteria beyond the ejection fraction. And several such criteria have been suggested and explored over the years. They looked at different ejection fraction subgroups, the very low, the moderate, and the mildly reduced. They looked at New York Heart Association, they looked at age and creatinine, except with the very high creatinine that I'm going to get back into, atrial fibrillation, QRS width. None of these criteria is strong enough to serve as a selection criterion by itself, as a standalone. There were several tests that were applied, such as the T-wave alternance, which wasn't done so much in Israel, and the electrophysiological studies. All of them were tested as means of better selection of ICD patients. And also there are multifactorial risk indexes that are more likely to help, because since none of the above criteria is strong enough, combining them into a multifactorial indexes may be more useful. Let's look at some of these elements in our registry data. If we look at the New York Heart Association group, looking at the New York Heart Association group, you can see here the New York Heart 1, 2, and 3. The survival over time did not differ between the New York Heart Association group, taking into account that we're looking at a year or a year and a half of follow-up. Now, you may argue that there should be a difference, and this difference may have been offset by the ICD. We are looking at an ICD population. However, if we look at the amount of therapies given by the ICDs, it's almost more or less the same. I tend to, since these data are contradictory to what we know from the literature, I tend to think that this particular observation has to do with the short follow-up time. If we look at the ejection fraction, it does behave according to what we know. If we look at the chances for appropriate therapy over time, and we're looking here, about here is 1 year, in our data of the follow-up of the ICD registry, patients with low ejection fraction tend to have more therapies delivered by the ICD than patients at higher ejection fraction groups. If we look at survival of these groups, they behave the same, more or less. Again, it may have to do with the short time of follow-up, or you may, if you're very optimistic, you may argue that the excessive treatment by ICD may have improved the survival. An important observation is looking at the GFR, or the renal function. If we look at a group of patients, as you know in the literature, it is claimed that patients with severe renal function do not benefit from ICDs because they have a high mortality rate anyway. And in a way, our data kind of support this notion. If you look at the patients with low GFR, below 30, they have a relatively high mortality rate over time, despite the fact that they have ICDs. So this is an observation that may support the notion that severe renal function do not benefit so much, although we don't have a control group, of course. An important issue in Israel was the use of electrophysiological study to predict the benefit of ICDs. I think that our data may put an end to this debate. If we look at the data of our patients in the follow-up group, we're looking at 3 groups. One of them is a group of patients who never had an electrophysiological study done. This is the rate of freedom from arrhythmia over time. If we look at the patient who were non-inducible in blue, they tended to have the patients who were non-inducible tended to have more arrhythmia over time. And the patients who were inducible were more or less the same as the patients who were never tested. So we found no correlation between the result of the EPS prior to ICD implantation and the following arrhythmia during follow-up. So our colleague Ilan Goldenberg, who now works in Israel, who is now back in Israel, suggested several years ago, based on the MEDI2 results, a multifactorial risk index that can help in selecting patients for ICD beyond the low ejection fraction. They looked at 20-something factors and selected 5 factors: age, BUN, QRS, history of atrial fibrillation, and New York Heart Association above 2. And a patient had to have at least one of them to benefit from an ICD. Patients who had low ejection fraction, but none of these risk factors, did not benefit at all, whereas patients who had 1, 2, or 3 factors or more did benefit. Another group that did not benefit was the very high-risk group of patients with severe renal failure. And this is kind of supported by our own results. Another issue in the management of ICD patients is the issue of inappropriate shocks. They used to be a huge issue in the past, but still, if you look at this study that summarizes the last 10 years in one of the Dutch centers, you see that there is an appropriate shock at the rate of close to 10% per year, which is a lot. And the main reasons for inappropriate shocks were supraventricular arrhythmia, especially atrial fibrillation, with some inappropriate shocks occurring on hardware failure, oversensing, and so on. Inappropriate shocks are a major problem. They result in severe pain, discomfort, they affect quality of life, they create huge emotional stress, they may be pro-arrhythmia, and may also deteriorate heart failure. There were several methods applied over the years to try to minimize inappropriate shocks. There were better algorithms to discriminate supraventricular from ventricular arrhythmia, better algorithms to diagnose immediately lead failure and shut off the device, better filters to try to discriminate between noise or T waves and real arrhythmia. But the most important advancement in this field was a novel programming approach that used longer detection time and higher rate cutoffs. This was based on a line of studies that tested this approach, but the last one of them was the PREPARE study. They applied the principle of using very long detection time so that short episodes will not be detected. And they also used a high cutoff rate, so episodes of 150, 160 BPM will not be detected. And they were able to drop the amount of inappropriate shocks very significantly. We actually looked at our own data at the Sheba Medical Center. We looked at 115 patients who were programmed according to this principle of the PREPARE trial, compared to 90 patients who were programmed in different ways, in the more traditional ways. We looked at the amount of inappropriate shock over time, and as you can see here on a relatively long follow-up, those who were programmed according to the PREPARE principles had much less incidence of inappropriate shocks compared to the traditional programming. So this change in approach of programming made a lot of difference, and if we look at the registry data, here, we had less than 5% inappropriate therapy per year. But if we're talking about shocks, we had 2 or 3 patients altogether. So there's a marked progress done in prevention of inappropriate shocks. And it shows also in our data here. A big issue in the ICD business now is the issue of system malfunctions, recalls, and infections. The last 2 more known ones are the Sprint Fidelis lead, Medtronic Fidelis lead that was recalled about several years ago, and the recent recall of the Reata lead of the St. Jude. Each one of them involves tens of thousands of patients worldwide. These are just pictures of the Reata lead that has extrusion of the conductors out of the lead. And this is a big deal, as well as the infection rate that is increasing. We looked at our own data. In our ICD registry, we had 941 non-initial procedure, meaning procedure on existing systems, replacement, repositions, and so on. Most of them were pack changes, generator changes. The other involved other procedures. 8.7% of our procedures were associated with recalls, which is a big burden. And also 2.5% of the procedures were related to infections. So this is a big problem that is expected to increase over the years, and we don't have good solution for them at this point. The last point that I would like to discuss with you is the issue of whether shocks cause deterioration of congestive heart failure and survival, and the chicken and egg dilemma. Is it the shock that deteriorates heart failure, or is it the heart failure that triggers the shock? We know that in the literature, shocks have been shown to be associated with deterioration of heart failure and reduced survival, and this was shown both in the MADE-2 data, also by Dr. Goldenberg, in the SCADEF data, and in other studies. The question of whether the shocks are the cause or the first marker of deterioration remains to be answered. Now, logically, if inappropriate shocks are not associated with deterioration, and if appropriate ATPs, antitachypasing, not shocks, are associated, then shocks are more likely to be markers than causes of deterioration. We took a brief look at our data. Take it with a grain of salt because the follow-up is relatively short. But if you look at our data, look at patients with appropriate therapy, any appropriate therapy, antitachypasing, shocks, they tended to increase their New York Heart Association class from the time of implantation to the time of follow-up, which is approximately 1 year later. If you look at patients who did not have any therapies, they tend to remain at the same New York Heart Association class. If we look only at patients who had shocks, the difference is more dramatic, although we must realize that the number of patients who received shocks was very, very small. But shocks were associated with a increase in New York Heart Association class. And if we look at inappropriate therapies, mostly anti-tachy pacing, some of them were shocks, there was no difference whatsoever. So these data kind of support the notion that shocks are markers of a deterioration in the status of the patient rather than the cause for deterioration. So let me summarize, ladies and gentlemen, that the vast majority of contemporary ICD implantations in Israel and everywhere are for primary prevention indications. Real-life benefit may be smaller than what we know from randomized controlled trials. Better selection criteria, maybe multifactorial risk scores, may increase the cost effectiveness and may prevent unnecessary implantations. The current practice of programming has a favorable effect on the amount of inappropriate and unnecessary shocks. Device recalls and infection are still a major cause for concern that seems to increase over time. And our observations support the notion that ICD shocks are markers rather than the cause of impending deterioration of heart failure. I would not conclude without thanking the scientific committee of the ICD Registry headed by Mahmoud Suleiman, who did a lot of work on this, and especially the team of the Israeli Society of Prevention of Heart Attack led by Professor Ilan Goldenberg and followed by the other members here, who did a lot of work in working up these data and preparing them for presentation. Thank you very much.